Part 3, the end of the war. This will go on for a while because a lot of things happen very quickly. And there'll be a couple of digressions on things that I've noticed need digressions being done for them. So off we go. Beginning of August, everything is going really badly for the Japanese. It's not going to go well for them. And the hierarchy doesn't seem to want to face that. Well, who can blame them, really? On the 1st, a B-29 incendiary raid on Toyama, site of a large aluminum-producing industry, burns out 95% of the city. The Toyama raid is only one of 4 big B-29 raids, using a total of 820 B-29s. The Americans have 820 B-29s. Additionally, B-24s and B-25s, now based on Okinawa, begin raiding targets in Kyushu. So even that air power can be brought to bear. The Japanese War Ministry issues orders that the kill-all plan, first issued on August 1st, 1944, detailing how all Allied POWs will be killed by the Japanese in the home islands and in island garrisons, and that will be enforced, that is to say, done, on August 22nd, 1945. This is intended to coincide with an expected Allied invasion of the home islands. The surrender of Japan will save most of these POWs, but some Japanese commanders will kill POWs in their custody anyway to cover up their mistreatment and murder of POWs. Over 1/3 of all U.S. soldiers kept in Japanese POW camps will not survive the war. In contrast, less than 1%, 1 in 100, of U.S. and British soldiers in German POW camps will die before the war ends. The mere existence of this kill-all order is vehemently disputed by the Japanese to this day. As we will see, the Japanese army destroyed many records at the end of the war, and very few of the kill-all orders survived, for obvious reasons. We do know that as the war reached its end, the Kempeitai murdered many POWs in the home islands, and garrisons in the Pacific killed their prisoners or not, depending on the commander at the time. Fortunately for history, the archives on some islands, and specifically Taiwan, missed destroying the document, and it survived. It also survived other places. The B-29s of Operation Starvation stopped dropping mines. They've run out after dropping 12,000 mines in the waters around the home islands. On the 2nd, the Potsdam Conference ends. The Emperor issues a prayerful report, which is sent to the Yusa Jingu Shrine on Kyushu, and again on August 2nd at the Kashigu Shrine, also on Kyushu, and it is read there by an imperial messenger. A prayerful report is essentially a situation report by the emperor to his ancestors. His says, quote, "We take up a new theme and humbly say, in the midst of this unprecedented great war, the fierce rage of Japan's formidable foes increases exponentially. Not only are there attacks day and night on the imperial capital, as well as places all across the nation, our islands are being violated one after the other. At last, the momentum is such that the home islands will be invaded. It is an exceedingly grave war situation, and Japan's destiny is truly connected. May the nation wholeheartedly rouse itself, and may it move to crush the enemy. Magnificent divine spirit, descend from your seat on high, and manifest your godly virtues. Grant also accomplishment of the sacred task of the timely elimination of the land of the gods' calamities. We offer this prayer, and we ask that you govern in accord with your purport. Humbly we speak these words," unquote. So the emperor is still not thinking anything about surrender. Foreign Minister Togo responds to Ambassador Sato that he is correct. Until Japan can figure out a negotiation position among the various competing factions in Tokyo, there's not much Sato can do. Prime Minister Suzuki tells a meeting of the Cabinet Advisory Council, made up of industrialists, bankers, and other businessmen, that the country can still be salvaged politically intact. Quote, "If we hold firm, they will yield before we do. Just because they broadcast their declaration, it is not necessary to stop fighting. Your advisors may ask me to reconsider, but I don't think there is any need to stop the war," unquote. On the 4th, on Tinian, 6 picked B-29 crews are given special instruction on A-bomb delivery. 720,000 leaflets are dropped on Hiroshima and other Japanese cities warning of an air attack, and that civilians should evacuate. As we know, this has limited usefulness, and is at least partially intending to disrupt the Japanese economy, as well as warn the civilians. U.S. radio intercepts reveal that the Japanese are looking for any pictures of U.S. attack transports that can be found. The U.S. is now aware of the Japanese anti-transport strategy for its kamikaze campaign against the Olympic landings, and can make preparations against it. On the 5th, the Little Boy atomic bomb is loaded into the currently unnamed Plane 82. It'll be flown by Paul Tibbets. Tibbets names the plane the Enola Gay after his mother, Enola Gay Tibbets. The name is hastily painted on the aircraft. Contrary to the intended procedure, Navy Captain Deke Parsons, asked permission to arm the little boy bomb in flight, because it would be really bad if the Enola Gay crashed on takeoff, for several large mountains of bad. His suggestion requires a quick modification to the arming mechanism, which Parsons himself will activate once the B-29 is airborne. He doesn't tell anybody that he has no idea how to do this. But no problem, he's got 4 hours to learn how. Ambassador Sato in Moscow sends again to Tokyo and repeats his opinion that Japan must surrender. Quote, if the government and the military dilly-dally, that's a translation of the word, in bringing this resolution to fruition, then all Japan will be reduced to ashes, unquote. He is, of course, correct, but nobody in Tokyo seems to be willing to listen. Stalin, back in Moscow from the Potsdam Conference, and now aware of the U.S. intention to drop the atomic bomb on Japan, advances the date of the Russian invasion of Manchuria by 5 days to August 10th. He doesn't want the Japanese to surrender before he seizes Manchuria. This is usually presented by the usual suspects as inverted, that the U.S. was intent on dropping the bomb before the Russians attacked, but in reality is the other way around. Stalin will, learning of the bombing of Hiroshima, move the invasion date up again. On August 6th, the 7th on the Japanese calendar, and all the times given in this part are going to be Japanese times. At 2:45 in the morning, Enola Gay lifts off from Tinian carrying Little Boy. At 3:15, now that the Enola Gay is at cruising altitude, Deke Parsons arms the bomb. At 6 a.m., Enola Gay and other B-29s rendezvous over Iwo Jima. There are now 6 B-29s. 3 are set to each fly to possible targets to check the weather. In addition, there's 1 photographic plane and another plane carrying other sensors. And of course, the Enola Gay. If all 3 target cities are clouded over, Enola Gay is ordered not to drop the bomb at all, but return to Tinian or Iwo Jima, depending on fuel. At 8:30 a.m., straight flush, the B-29 checking the weather over Hiroshima reports that cloud cover over the city is sparse enough to permit bombing. Tibbets decides to go to Hiroshima. At 9:09 a.m., Enola Gay flies within sight of Hiroshima. At 9:15 a.m., Little Boy, the uranium gun-type atomic bomb, is dropped on Hiroshima from the Enola Gay. After the bomb is dropped, Enola Gay makes a hard 150-degree turn to escape the worst of the blast shockwaves. 43 seconds later, Little Boy explodes 1,800 feet over the aiming point, AOI Bridge. The force of the explosion is later determined to be 13,000 tons of TNT, that is 13 kilotons. 70,000 people are killed immediately by the explosion, either by burning from the flash or by the shockwave. The exact number of people killed varies depending on whose account you read, but it's irrelevant. Tens of thousands of people are killed immediately. Among the killed are headquarters personnel of the Japanese 2nd General Army commanding units to defend Western Honshu. Many more people will die later of radiation and blast effects if they weren't killed immediately. While one may recover from non-lethal radiation by rest and lots of fluids, neither of those are available for the survivors of Hiroshima. 67% of the buildings in the city are completely destroyed and the rest damaged. The explosion creates a mushroom cloud that reaches 20,000 feet in 1 minute and continues up to 50,000 feet. 2 shockwaves are felt by the Enola Gay and the other 2 B-29s in the area. The first from the bomb itself and the second from the bomb shockwave reflecting off Hiroshima and going up into the air. At 9:40, Deke Parsons sends a radio message reporting the successful bombing of Hiroshima to Tinian. At 2:58 p.m., Enola Gay lands on Tinian. Immediately, over 600 B-29s now take off for other targets in Japan, so the firebombing just goes on. At midnight Tokyo time, 11 a.m. U.S. Eastern War time, Washington releases a message written before Truman left for Potsdam announcing a new type of bomb has been dropped on Japan. He says that the Japanese refused the demand for unconditional surrender in the Potsdam Declaration on July 26th. Quote, their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Behind this air attack will follow sea and land forces in such numbers and power as they have not yet seen, and with the fighting skill of which they are already well aware. Unquote. The message also gives general outlines of how much effort has gone into creating the bomb. He characterizes the bomb as, quote, harnessing the basic power of the universe, the force from which the sun draws its power, unquote, which is wrong. That's more correctly characterized the hydrogen bomb, which shows up later. While all this is going on, Truman is still on board the USS Augusta, returning from Potsdam. Foreign Minister Togo cables Sato in Moscow that he should meet with Molotov at once and demand, Togo's word, Molotov's reply to the message that asked for the Soviets to act as an intermediary. On August 7th, Togo cables Sato again after an eyewitness to the damage from the bombing of Hiroshima has returned to Tokyo to say that the entire city was destroyed by a single bomb. Togo writes, quote, "The situation is becoming so acute, we must have a clarification of the Soviet attitude as soon as possible," unquote. Togo then goes to the cabinet and says that Japan could now surrender using the inhumanity of the A-bomb as a pretext. The cabinet is unmoved. The army representatives say they want to wait until more information is available. Togo then meets with the emperor, who agrees with this scheme to end the fighting quickly, but although, quote, "We could no longer continue the struggle now that a weapon of this devastating power was used against us, we should not let slip the opportunity by engaging in attempts to gain more favorable conditions." The emperor is still following the Japanese strategy of imposing conditions on the Americans. In any case, the Big Six is as deadlocked as it ever was. They're unwilling to stop the fighting while the future of Japan is undefined to their satisfaction. On Tinian, the final assembly of Fat Man, the plutonium bomb, begins. The Japanese Foreign Ministry begins destroying records of correspondence, memos, and anything else from 1931 on. This will make reconstructing Japanese political decisions more difficult, and also for being used in war crimes trials. But that's a lot of paper. It's going to take a while, and they ain't going to finish. Also, some employees will take documents home with them to save them from the fires. But these will not be revealed as being saved until it is, quote, safe, unquote, to do so, decades later. Even so, the destruction of records will not be complete when the Foreign Ministry is seized by U.S. occupation forces. Records of the Emperor's chamberlains, their diaries of Hirohito's appointments and conversations, do survive, as does the Emperor's personal diary. Will not be released until 1968. Some are still secret, and most have not been translated. Radio Tokyo issues a condemnation of the U.S. A-bombing of Hiroshima. The U.S. is described as, quote, "the destroyer of mankind and as public enemy number one of social justice," unquote. Stalin, now that he's been beaten to the punch by the bombing of Hiroshima, orders the invasion of Manchuria moved up to the 9th of August. Groves, in Washington, calls Oppenheimer in Los Alamos to congratulate him on the successful bombing of Hiroshima, and that Oppenheimer was the right man to run Los Alamos. Later that day, everybody in Los Alamos is informed of the bombing. Quote, "One of our units has just been successfully dropped on Japan," unquote. Alice Kimball Smith, who lives at Los Alamos, where her husband is a metallurgist, will later write that there was a party that evening, quote, "a fiasco. Certainly no one at Los Alamos celebrated Hiroshima," unquote. This seems to be Ms. Smith rewriting her memory for her own needs to assuage her own guilt. Other people at Los Alamos describe not one party, but at least 3, at which people danced, listened to the radio, and were, quote, "happy, very happy," unquote. Digression. Rewriting history is the sport of mankind. The disingenuous guilt over the use of the A-bomb, that for some will last for the rest of their lives, at least in public, is annoying to me. These people have been working for up to 3 years on a revolutionary explosive device on behalf of the U.S. military. The purpose of their work was A-bombs. Bombs kill people. That smart people would suddenly discover that their work on a bomb to kill people would in fact kill people means they either have the worldview of a child or just lie to themselves and everybody around them. Still on the 7th, Ambassador Harriman reports to Washington that he has asked Molotov what Molotov thought the Japanese thought about the A-bombing of Hiroshima. Molotov impassively responds, "Well, I have not heard yet. You Americans can keep a secret when you want to." Considering the spying efforts going on in the United States, that's probably the funniest thing Molotov said in his entire life. Stalin sends instructions to his commander in Siberia to attack Mongolia early on the morning of the 9th. B-29s drop 11 million leaflets on Japanese cities containing a translation of Truman's message announcing the bombing of Hiroshima. It also details Japanese rejection of the Potsdam Declaration. Remember, it's still mokusetsu. On the 8th, Togo sends again to Sato in Moscow to find out, quote, "the explicit attitude of the Russians," unquote. Molotov agrees to meet with Sato in the evening of the 8th. When the two men meet, Molotov immediately reads Sato the Soviet Union Declaration of War on Japan, which dashes the Japanese hopes of being able to use the Soviets to broker a peace of some sort. The Russians explicitly mention Japanese attempts at getting a peace feeler through the Soviets. The declaration also says that Russia has been asked to join the war with Japan by the Allied powers, and that Russia is acting to, quote, "contribute to the early restoration of universal peace," unquote. Almost simultaneously, the Russians invade Manchuria with more than 1 million men, with 5,500 tanks and self-propelled artillery vehicles supported by 5,000 aircraft to take on the 700,000-man Kwangtung Japanese Army of Occupation in Manchuria. The Russian attack is known as Operation August Storm. The Japanese are pushed back very strongly immediately. It's clear that Stalin has been repeatedly moving up the date of the attack because he's worried the Japanese might give up on the Soviets and find some other country to act as a mediator and make peace one way or another before the Russians can declare war. He wanted to get in that attack while the getting was good. On Tinian, the 509th technicians complete the assembly of Fat Man. It'll be ready to use on the 9th. Limited rail service to and from Hiroshima is established. Harold Jacobson, a physician from Columbia, often described as a scientist by people who want to make his words more weighty, but he was just a physician, who briefly worked at the Met Lab, writes a letter to the San Francisco Examiner, which is published today and picked up by the wire services, in which he announces that Hiroshima will be entirely uninhabitable for the next 70 years. This story of scientist Jacobson is one of those things that gets repeated over and over again by authors who simply cut and paste from each other's books. Queried by Groves about Jacobson's article, Oppenheimer will reply that this is, of course, lunacy. Jacobson himself will later claim he had not written the letter at all. So where did it come from? Russian advances into Manchuria of up to 100 kilometers are made. The Russians have learned well from the Germans, using combined arms groups in assaults, with breakthroughs being driven deep into Japanese lines, leaving holdouts to be overwhelmed by follow-on troops. The major impediments the Russians face early on are swampy terrain in the east and heat, dust, and a lack of water from local sources in the west. Unit 731, maker and tester of a variety of evils, begins trying to erase their own existence. All prisoners still alive are murdered, their bodies incompletely burned, buildings are dynamited, and records burned. Unit 731 personnel are given priority to transport back to Japan so they won't be captured by the Russians. But some are anyway. These Japanese will be taken to a special camp and Russian pattern interrogation will be used on them for years. The information they obtain will become the basis for Russian development of their own biological warfare program. Boxcar, carrying the Fat Man plutonium bomb, takes off from Tinian. The bomb is already armed. Its complex implosion design requires it to be armed before taking off. If the plane had crashed on takeoff, as several did that day, a significant portion of Tinian would have just been vaporized. The original primary target for Fat Man was Kokura, site of a large arsenal, but cloud cover obscures the target, and Boxcar, like Enola Gay, was ordered to drop only on a visible target. Their backup target is Nagasaki. Boxcar flying around first Kokura, trying to find a hole in the clouds, and then to Nagasaki, has run gasoline so far down that it can no longer return to Tinian or Iwo Jima no matter what. Okinawa is the emergency landing field, otherwise the bomber will have to ditch at sea. Boxcar finds a hole in the clouds over Nagasaki, and Fat Man is dropped on Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. local time, with the Mitsubishi Ordnance Plant as the aiming point. Fat Man detonates at 1,500 feet above the city with a force of 22,000 tons of TNT. The bombing of Nagasaki kills at least 39,000 people immediately, and radiation sickness will take its toll as well. Because of the geographical idiosyncrasies of Nagasaki, Boxcar will be hit by 5 distinct shockwaves from the bomb and then reflections off various hills and valleys of the city. Since they're short on gas, Boxcar and its photographic support B-29, the Great Artiste, head for Okinawa. As Boxcar lands on Yotan Field on Okinawa, 2 of its engines cut out. They're out of fuel. A couple hours later, both planes are refueled and on their way back to Tinian. Damage to Nagasaki is less than Hiroshima's, due to these same geographical factors. Some parts of the city don't even lose electrical power. There has been, after the fact, considerable debate on whether the second bombing, or indeed the first, was necessary. Anti-arguers say that a pause should have been taken to see what the Japanese would do. Pro-arguers say, as was said at the time, that the second bombing so close to the first would convince the Japanese that the U.S. had a bazillion of these bombs and convert Japan to glass if the U.S. so chose. And this would appear to have had exactly the effect hoped for. Japanese Army and Navy representatives in government had assured the Council and the Emperor that such bombs were so complex that the U.S. could have only one, and thus the Japanese had time to consider what to do. The second bombing will crush any such faint hopes on that score. A number of people, including historian Toshiyoshi Hasegawa, say that the atomic bombings had very little to do with the Japanese surrender in any case, and that the Soviet invasion of Manchuria and declaration of war was more important because the Japanese could not have a back channel to negotiate with the Americans. These assertions are contradicted by what people, including the Emperor himself, said at the time, but that never stopped a historian before. In Tokyo, the Big Six meet again without the Emperor. Foreign Minister Togo tries to pin the military down on the defense of the home islands. He asks the Chief of the Army General Staff, Umezu Yoshijiro, quote, "Are you confident you can prevent the enemy from landing on the Japanese homeland?" Unquote. Umezo responds in the affirmative, and will more forcefully do so in a cabinet meeting later today. Anami then announces that the Americans have 100 A-bombs ready to use and intend to drop 3 of them a month, starting with Tokyo. Anami's reasoning is a little obscure, but I think he means that the only way out is to defeat the invasion and bring the Americans to the negotiation table from the one great defeat plan. And so he means, I think, that the Americans' A-bombs are irrelevant, I think. Prime Minister Suzuki obtains from Keeper of the Privy Seal Kido, who is speaking for the Emperor, a promise for the Emperor to intervene at the next Imperial Conference, which is later today, on the side of peace, though, as we will see, not actual surrender. Suzuki will hold this last card to try and break the endless logjam. The Japanese Emperor has not intervened in this way, giving direct orders versus indirect influence, in 50 years, since the adoption of the Meiji Constitution that declared the Emperor a living god. Meanwhile, Admiral Takagi meets with the head of the Navy, Admiral Yonai. Yonai complains to Takagi that Prime Minister Suzuki flip-flops between hardline and peace rhetoric. Nobody knows where he really stands. Later today, the Emperor will tell the army commanders and staff of the Japanese army that he is dissatisfied with the actual preparation for a landing versus what is claimed by the army. Quote, "Your plans are never executed. Given that, how can we win the war?" Unquote. He continues that the Army's plan with its 100 million people strategy is almost certain to lead to the extinction of the Japanese people, or at least the eradication of Japan's political system, with the Emperor Supreme as the living god. For the first time, the Emperor has point-blank declared the Japanese military incapable of defending the home islands. One would think that the military would cave right away without the confidence of the Emperor. The implication is that the Emperor has finally discovered that the military has always been promising more than it can deliver. The Army's response is to change absolutely nothing, except to dig deeper into their do-or-die posturing. The Emperor also expresses the fear that there might be, if the war goes on, an uprising of the rightfully wrathful people who will themselves destroy the institution of the Emperor. Now this puts a new spin on the reasons for a Japanese surrender, which are normally described in histories as either being due to the Russian invasion of Manchuria, or the atomic bombs, or both. But if you read deeper, the Japanese leadership is just as concerned with what the people will do if they do surrender. And also to that must be added the fear that the army would seize power itself and impose a fight-to-the-end regime. The longer a surrender is postponed, the more likely a coup to protect the emperor from the traitors would become. And now, back to the war, which is always in progress. Later on the 9th, U.S. Ambassador Harriman meets with Stalin in Moscow. Stalin gives him a status report on the advance in Manchuria, which is stomping the Japanese. Harriman asks Stalin what effect he thinks the A-bomb will have on the Japanese. Stalin replies it will give the government a pretext to replace itself with a softer version that can surrender. Harriman comments that nobody was sure until it was tested that the bomb would work at all, which is not quite accurate. The gun-type bomb was too stupid to fail, so that would have worked. Stalin replies that Soviet scientists have told him, quote, "It is a very difficult problem to work out," unquote. Now, Stalin has just let slip that, number one, there's a nuclear bomb research program in the USSR, and two, the problem has already been worked out on how to make one. But no one notices. The army issues to the Kwangtung Army in Manchuria and units in northern China to prepare a counterattack against the Russian advances. The Chinese Expeditionary Army in China is to move into Korea to defend that. U.S. leaflets are dropped on Japanese cities announcing the Russian declaration of war on Japan. At a meeting of the War Cabinet, Foreign Minister Togo asked Army Chief of Staff Umezo if, in view of the atomic bombing and the Soviet declaration of war, he is still confident he can defend the home islands from invasion. Umezo replies, quote, "If it goes extremely well, we can even repel the enemy. Because it is a war, however, it is hard to conceive that it will definitely go well. While we will concede some landings, I am confident that we can inflict severe casualties on the enemy during their invasion," unquote. Is that a yes or a no? The army is continuing to hold on to that one great defeat strategy, even without the Russian attacks into Manchuria. Senior officials meet later in the day in Tokyo to discuss the situation. The military says it wants negotiations, but with specific goals. These are known as the 4 conditions, which we've talked about before. No disarmament of the military, no occupation, preservation of the, quote, national polity, the existing political system with the status of the emperor unchanged, and no war crimes trials. The so-called doves will instead push for the Potsdam Declaration, but with the national polity provision. This is known as the 1 condition. After 3 hours of debate, nothing is decided. This fight over 4 conditions versus 1 conditions will dominate internal Japanese debate, with continuing confidence that the Americans can be made to accept one or all conditions. But the Japanese, especially the Army, are still intent, Hiroshima and Manchuria or not, they will not surrender unconditionally. The reasoning is that neither Hiroshima or Nagasaki or Manchuria are direct threats to the national polity, so are nowhere near as direct a threat as a surrender that doesn't guarantee the polity. In the afternoon, at yet another meeting, Prime Minister Suzuki tells the cabinet that they must come to a quick decision about making peace. The cabinet indulges in the same arguments as among the big 6, 4 conditions or 1. 7 hours later, no decision is made. A suggestion by Education Minister Ota that the cabinet as a whole resign to allow a more moderate cabinet to take over is turned down. To try and put together a new cabinet would take time the Japanese just don't have. The Americans will not wait forever. Late in the evening, military and government representatives are summoned for an imperial conference to press their cases, 4 conditions or 1. Each side lays out its case. In describing the threat to the nation from the Soviets, Army Chief of Staff Umezo characterizes it as, quote, unfavorable, unquote, and that the Ketsugo plan to defend the home islands is still the best for the country. Since the Soviets have nothing like a navy to invade the home islands, the Army can just stick out their chins and describe the loss of China and Manchuria as not being threats to the nation. The president of the Privy Seal Council retorts that the nation will shortly run out of food. The emperor agrees that surrender is the best path and that the 1 condition response should be given. He refuses to abandon his position of himself as a living god. So the Japanese will make a second reply, after the Mokosetsu reply, to the Potsdam Declaration via the Swiss and Swedish embassies that requires that any surrender not include, quote, any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler, unquote. The emperor's exact words to the meeting are, quote, to rescue our people from a catastrophe and for the happiness of all humankind in the world, I have decided to accept the Potsdam Declaration on the condition proposed by the foreign minister, unquote. The foreign minister's proposal is the 1 condition. This is described as Hirohito's first intervention. So surrender with conditions, again. The emperor also says that, quote, an immediate ceasefire would leave the core foundation for Japan's future development, unquote. So the Americans should stop winning the war quite so well and give the Japanese what they want. Negotiations, which they expect to win by their own definitions. Again. This is later taken by gullible people as the emperor imposing his will for surrender on the Big 6, though this is in fact nothing of the kind. The emperor has for the past few months been saying he wanted the war to end, but with the 4 conditions, and nothing has happened. All that's changed is the emperor is willing to surrender but still leave himself as the sole ruler of Japan, and as we've seen, the ruler of any occupation forces as well. The meeting has continued into the 10th. Afterward, the entire cabinet signs the papers authorizing the acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, but with the 1 condition, to save the polity. So, the national polity. This 1 condition response from the Japanese is taken by the U.S. and the Russians with considerable justification that it is a requirement for the power structure in Japan to be untouched, since the prerogatives of the emperor includes selecting the government, dictating the laws, maintaining the aristocracy, and so on. In one of the, quote, commentaries on the Constitution of 1889, unquote, there's a passage that says, quote, the emperor is heaven descended, divine and sacred. He must be reverenced and is inviolable. The law has no power to hold him accountable, unquote. So if the national polity is kept intact, basically we have the same government we have now. Any state with the Japanese prerogatives intact is the same state that started the war with China, the U.S., Britain, and anybody in range. With the prerogatives intact, the emperor will still rule Japan, and any occupation force will be there at his whim. Any commander of the occupation force will be under the emperor's command. August 10th. When the imperial conference breaks up, the military is still convinced, despite the emperor's words, that the 4 conditions are the only acceptable reply. Nevertheless, the emperor has ordered the 1 condition message sent, but the army appears to be intent on going its own way. Again. The military's role in Japanese politics. The Japanese military, extending back into the 1920s, took upon itself an activist role in government. In 1923, the army's Kempeitai murdered 3 politicians who happened to be anarchists. In 1929, the army precipitated a war with the Soviet Union over Manchuria, which was fought to a draw. In 1931, the army tried twice to cow the civilian Japanese government with the threat of a coup to install a military government to do what the military wanted. In 1932, the Navy murdered the Japanese Prime Minister. In 1936, the Army staged another coup, murdering several government ministers. The Japanese intervention in Manchuria in 1931 was engineered by the Army, essentially presenting the Japanese government with a conquest already completed, which the government had to package as a request by the Manchurians for Japanese assistance. The Japanese invasion of China was engineered by the Army in 1937, beginning what would become the Second World War. Again, done without the civilian or imperial knowledge or permission. Many Japanese still deny that war crimes committed in China happened at all, by the way. In 1939, the Army fought another engineered unofficial war with the USSR over Mongolia, which the Japanese lost. And that may have been the source of the Japanese unwillingness to join the Germans in their attack on the USSR in 1941. They already knew what the Russians were like, and they didn't like it. And it can well be argued the attacks of 1941 were engineered by the Navy, dragging the Japanese government along with it. There are other such events, but this list shows the Japanese military's high-handed attitude of intervention into Japanese politics, which will continue pretty much up to the dissolution of the Japanese military itself. Japanese foreign minister sends a message via the Japanese Domei news agency radio station in Tokyo to the Allies that Japan is willing to accept terms of the Potsdam Declaration and surrender if the prerogatives of the emperor are kept in place. For some reason, there are actually two translations of this message, both by the Japanese. The second one says, instead, on the condition that the stipulations that the declaration does not include any demand for the alteration of the emperor to rule the state. If this sounds like Mokotetsu again, you're not wrong. The Japanese intention to maintain their government and military is plainer in the second version. In fact, the authority message may be while trying to sneak the four conditions in, claiming that they are one condition. Later in the morning, War Minister General Inami meets with all high-ranking officers in the War Ministry to tell them that no attempts to overturn the government's surrender decision will be tolerated. In other words, he's forbidding a coup. Navy Admiral Toyota gives a similar warning to the Navy General Staff. Inami also goes to Suzuki and asks him point blank if Suzuki will continue the war if the emperor's prerogative condition is not met. Suzuki tells Inami he will vote to continue the war in that case. This is somewhat at odds with Suzuki's reputation in history books as a peace advocate. Inami then makes a radio broadcast to the army that the war has taken a bad turn, since the Russians have now added themselves to the mix. Quote, even though we must eat grass and chew dirt and lay in the field, we must fight to the bitter end, ever firm in our belief that we shall find life in death, unquote. He also makes a reference to the 7 lives for the country and Tokiyume Hojo's attack on the Mongols in 1281. Yeah, 1281. Truman sends to Stalin he would like to divide Korea into 2 zones, the U.S. in the south and the USSR in the north. Truman, of course, is hoping to stop the Russians from taking it all, since it's becoming increasingly clear that the Japanese can't stop the Russian invasion at all. To pretty much everybody's surprise, Stalin agrees. B-29s begin again on Japanese cities and will continue through August 14th. This is under the specific orders of Truman. In the afternoon, the Japanese cabinet meets to figure out how to break the news of the surrender to the people of Japan. The government has been for years blaring to the population that they must prepare for a battle for the home islands that will probably see them all die. With a commendable lack of bravery, the cabinet decides to not do anything until the emperor himself announces the surrender via an imperial rescript, which is a pronouncement. The cabinet fears that, with considerable justification, that if the surrender is not announced by the emperor himself, the people will rise up and overthrow at least the government, and maybe the emperor, enraged by the hollowness of the sacrifices that have been made and may yet be made. The cabinet is worried about a civil war, which must be avoided. In the meantime, the Japanese government issues a statement to the Japanese people that, although acknowledging that things are not great, it ends with, quote, despite the prompt action taken by our forces to check enemy aggression, we must admit our fortunes are now at their lowest ebb. The government will do its utmost to defend the national polity and the honor of the nation. But at the same time, the government expects you, the 100 million of Japan, to overcome all difficulties to uphold our national polity, unquote, which is also known as the Kukutai. At a U.S. cabinet meeting in the afternoon, James Burns reads out the Japanese second response to the Potsdam Declaration, the one with the any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. Truman and Burns decide to reply what will become known as the, quote, Burns Note, unquote, which is sent to the Swiss embassy, who give it to the Japanese. The Burns Note has 5 provisions. Number 1, the emperor from the time of surrender is subject to the supreme commander of the occupational forces. That is, he's no longer supreme anywhere. Number 2, the emperor is required to authorize the signing of the surrender documents and order all Japanese military units to cease offensive operations, disarm, and obey orders from the supreme commander of the occupation force. That's going to be MacArthur. Number 3, immediately upon surrender, POWs and civilian internees will be transported to places of safety until they can be transported home. That is, away from anybody who wants to kill them. Number 4, the form of the Japanese government after surrender will be determined by the Japanese people in free elections. That is, not only will the national polity not be kept in place, it will be destroyed and rebuilt. And number 5, Allied armed forces of occupation will remain in Japan until all elements of the Potsdam Declaration are achieved. Now, some people think that this is somehow giving an out to the Japanese, but if you read it carefully, the Burns Note doesn't offer anything new or anything changed. Some people think that the Burns Note was watering down unconditional surrender. It wasn't. It just looked like it was. The Burns Note makes clear that surrender means surrender, up to and including the emperor himself. The military will be disarmed, no reprisals or oops on POWs. The government, including potentially the emperor, will be what the Japanese people want, whatever that is. The occupation will continue as long as the Allies like. No face-saving will be allowed. Keeping the emperor in place is simple expediency, and only that, to make sure the military plays ball. Beyond that, no promises. It's exactly what the hardliners in Japan fear. But the Allies are perfectly happy to keep right on reducing the home islands to ruins with a starving population. That's exactly what everybody who isn't a hardliner fears. Perhaps worst of all to the elites, this defeat can in no way be packaged to the Japanese people as anything but a complete defeat. For the Japanese military, not only will they be shown to have lost, not only will they have been shown to be incompetent, not only would they be shown to have misled the emperor and cover up their failures, not only will they be shown to have lost control of the air and sea and opening civilians up to be killed in the thousands, the military itself will be dissolved. They won't even be allowed to keep their swords. This is a peace that is acceptable to the American people. The Japanese government and military will be dismantled, all conquests given up, and the emperor himself humbled. On August the 11th, a group of Japanese junior officers, led by 22-year-old Major Kenji Hatanaka, meet in the Air Ministry's air raid shelter to plot a coup to rescue the emperor from, quote, traitorous advisors, unquote. Lieutenant Colonel Takashita, on the staff of the War Ministry, writes in his diary, quote, the atmosphere within the ministry is restive. People are determined to find some way to crush the movement towards peace. Some officers advocate the use of terrorism, calling for the murder of Hiramuta, Konye, Suzuki, Sakomizu, Yonai, and Togo. That's basically every member of the cabinet that these guys think is advocating surrender. And as we've seen, the army is not above doing this kind of thing. Others argue that War Minister Anami should exercise his authority to deploy troops for the maintenance of public security, which is in effect a coup. The wildest kinds of schemes are discussed quite openly, unquote. Takashita will propose this very kill the peacemakers plan to Anami, with a backup plan that if the emperor is not convinced to continue the war ministry brass go to the emperor and kill themselves one by one in front of him to convince the emperor to fight on. The Big Six meets to consider the Burns Note in this surrender dance. Although Burns and Truman had hoped the Burns Note would give the supposed Japanese peace faction something to use against the hardliners, they never notice that it doesn't help. Because of the way the Big Six is set up, the hardliners can just block any changes as long as they like. The magic codebreakers intercept a message from Vice Chief of the Army Kawabe to the military attachés in Sweden, Switzerland, and Portugal that says that both the Army and Navy are intent on ignoring the Burns Note and fighting to the finish to, quote, preserve the national structure, even if it means the destruction of the Army and Navy, unquote. Despite diplomatic efforts to make peace, the Army will, quote, continue the war to the bitter end, unquote. The message ends that while there might be a, quote, peace propaganda offensive and all sorts of reports in every country, by carrying on the fight without a let-up, you are to keep what we have said in mind, unquote. There's still chaos at the top of the Japanese hierarchy. The Army and the Navy, mostly the Army, are not really interested in peace of any sort. Learning of the imminence of a Japanese surrender, General Yatsuhiko Okamura, commanding the million-man Japanese army in China, announces, quote, I am finally convinced that it is time to exert all our efforts to fight to the end, determined that the whole army should die an honorable death without being distracted by the enemy's peace offensive, unquote. In the United States, the, quote, Atomic Energy for Military Purposes, unquote, book, also known as the Smythe Report, a sort of popular history of the Manhattan Project, is published. Despite its technical nature, it goes on the New York Times bestseller list on October 14th and remains there for 14 weeks. It will remain in print until 1973. It's a pretty good survey. Our old friend Leo Szilard writes to the military secrecy officers of the Met Lab that he is unilaterally declassifying his July 17th petition to the president at 5:30 p.m. on the 13th. He says he will release the petition to, quote, persons not connected with our project, unquote. That is, the press. Leo is, even at this late date, trying to elbow his way into control of the use of A-bombs. Grove's reaction to Szilard's ultimatum is simple. The entire petition is already classified. Groves just says that if he releases it, Szilard will be guilty of a crime under the Espionage Act. Szilard will back down. An edited version of the Frank Report will not appear in public until the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists issue of May 1946. On the 12th, the chiefs of the Japanese Army and Navy send a memo to the Emperor that to accept the Burns Note would, quote, desecrate the Emperor's dignity, unquote, and make Japan a, quote, slave nation, unquote. The Emperor replies to the memo that the service chiefs are drawing hasty conclusions. He tells Army Minister Anami, quote, do not worry, Anami, I have conclusive proof, unquote, that his position as Emperor is not threatened, which is kind of true. He'll still be called the Emperor, but I have no power. So surely the Emperor is lying to Anami in hopes of heading off any reaction by the army to seize power. The Japanese president of the Privy Council, Baron Hiranuma, meets separately with Suzuki and Kido to register his opposition to the Burns Note status of the Emperor. Hiranuma says he needs a clarification of the Emperor under the occupation commander demand. Of course, the Burns Note is that clarification. War Minister Anami, who you might remember told the army not to stage a coup, is now telling officers who ask him that he will not oppose such a coup. He also tells Suzuki he opposes surrender. The Emperor meets with the members of his family and tells them of his decision to accept the Burns Note. He wants to head off any rebel emperor situation where a prince, for instance, is declared emperor by military coup plotters, so to avoid a War of the Roses kind of situation in Japan. This is all happening really fast, as you can tell. Kido meets with Prime Minister Suzuki, who is wavering between accepting the Burns Note or not, to convince him to accept the Emperor's will. Suzuki gives way, but he's given way before. Navy Minister Yanai meets with Chief of the Navy General Staff Toyoda. Yanai says he is worried about an uprising of the people, and if the war is not continued, he sees a real danger of a not-a-war Japan being torn up into little states by rebels. He says that because he has urged the acceptance of the Burns Note, Army bigwigs are calling him a wimp. That word is from a translation by Takashi Ito in his book published in 2000. Yanai wants to keep the authority the government and the military have because of the war. If the war ends, that authority will be gone, and the people can no longer be controlled. Yanai then says something quite interesting. The atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, God's gift. Now we can end the war without making it clear that we have to end the war because of the domestic situation. I have long been advocating the conclusion of the war, not because I'm afraid of the enemy's attacks or because of the atomic bombs or the Soviet participation in the war. The most important reason is my concern over the domestic situation. Therefore, it is rather fortunate that we can end the war without bringing the domestic situation to the surface. Takagi agrees. This is again from Takashi's book, who in turn cites a August 12, 1945 memorandum of the meeting. Yanai is voicing the hope of many in the leadership to be able to claim to the Japanese people that the end of the war was forced on them by the atomic bomb and not by any conventional military defeat. This is kind of an echo of what the Germans said in 1918, to be able to claim that they were not defeated in the field of combat. And that went really well for the world, didn't it? And the 13th, a message from the Japanese ambassador to Sweden, Okamoto, to the foreign ministry in Tokyo, says that local news in Sweden says that the U.S. has successfully overwritten Soviet wishes to remove the emperor from post-war Japan, and that the emperor, he says, would remain. This, Okamoto says, means that the Americans had actually agreed to the one-condition Japanese response. This is based on, shall we say, an optimistic analysis of the Potsdam Declaration and what's going on diplomatically, which the Swedish Japanese have been doing all along, but is not doing anybody any favors. In the evening, a final showdown cabinet meeting is held in the presence of the emperor. The holdouts are allowed to speak their piece. Vice Admiral Onishi harangues the meeting with, quote, if the entire nation commits to accepting the sacrifice of 20 million people, then victory will be ours, unquote. That's about 1/3 of all adults in Japan. The emperor then says he wants the Burns Note be accepted as a basis of surrender, but does not specifically order it. So the military will feel like they still have a chance to block any surrender. The cabinet decides that the announcement of the surrender, broadcast by radio, of the recorded voice of the emperor will be made at noon on the 15th. The words of the emperor, by the emperor himself, are the only way to convince the military to actually surrender. And as we will see, not even then. The emperor agrees. The press is informed but not urged to deliver any newspapers containing news of the emperor's broadcast. Anami tells Kido that in addition to objections over the status of the emperor, he now objects to any of the Burns Note's specifications that POWs be transported to places of safety. I suspect Anami is hoping to keep them as hostages. Kido tells Anami that the Burns Note is not a menu to be picked and chosen from, all or nothing. One of the interesting things about this is that The Japanese are now arguing about the Burns Note and not recognizing that the Burns Note is really just a repackaging of the Potsdam Declaration. Following the meeting with the Emperor, another meeting of the Big Six settles nothing. The War Minister and the chiefs of the Army and Navy General Staffs want to fight on. The Premier, the Navy, and Foreign Minister want to surrender. By the rules of government, the Big Six must be unanimous, so nothing is decided. Again. Later in the evening, officers planning an anti-surrender coup meet Anami at his residence to obtain his commitment to a coup. Anami hedges his bets, and he promises to give them a decision tomorrow, on the 14th. On the 14th, B-29s drop 5 million leaflets over Tokyo and other Japanese cities describing the Japanese acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration and the progress towards peace. This is the first time the news of this has reached the Japanese public, which is entirely the point. Kido will show one of these leaflets to the Emperor, and the possibility of a public uprising is now thought to be even more likely unless the Emperor gives the words of surrender himself. If the people believe that surrender is imminent, they'll be less likely to die like they've been told anyway. So the Emperor is presented with a situation where things are unraveling very quickly and he must act. The Emperor summons Army Marshal Sugiyama and Marshal Hata and Marshal Admiral and Nagano to solicit their views on what's going on and the Japanese options. Osami says that since the Japanese are probably not going to be able to resist the Olympic invasion, the Potsdam surrender is inevitable. The army marshals insist that the army has enough strength and morale to be able to not only resist, but to repel any invasion force. Sure. The emperor then summons the entire cabinet to the palace and has Suzuki read out the summary of what's been going on since the 10th. And then he invites cabinet ministers who oppose surrender to speak their minds, including the big six who oppose surrender, Anami, Toyoda, and Umezo. They say that the Burns Note needs clarification to be sure that the national polity is maintained. This is just playing for time in hopes of changing the emperor's mind or something. The emperor then speaks, saying that he requests that all present support him in accepting the Potsdam Declaration and the Burns Note. Otherwise, he says there'll be nothing left of Japan. This is known as the emperor's second intervention. The emperor's will, of course, should not be gainsaid, except it will. The emperor asks the cabinet to come up with what he will say in his radio address. In the evening, the surrender rescript, the proclamation, is presented to the emperor to read on the radio. Later in the evening, NHK, the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation, audio engineers arrive at the imperial palace to record the emperor's surrender speech onto phonograph records. The speech will become known as the Jewel Voice Broadcast, the Gyukoan Hosho. The emperor records the speech twice. The first is deemed too indistinct, and the second one more understandable, but inaccurately read. The second recording is deemed to be the official one. The recording is 4 minutes and 45 seconds long. The English translation of what the emperor says is 652 words long. Since the emperor uses what's known as courtly language, kango, it's not understood by almost all Japanese, and an NHK spokesman will have to perform a translation of the emperor's words after the radio broadcast so the common people can understand it. Meanwhile, Radio Tokyo begins broadcasting the news that the emperor will speak to the nation. Just not what about. This news will put a spur to the frantic Japanese military hotheads' plans to sabotage the broadcast, on the pretext that traitorous advisors have convinced the emperor to surrender. British Minister John Balfour sends to the Foreign Office in London that while speaking to Truman, the president said that the latest telegram from Tokyo via the Swiss, quote, did not contain the message awaited by the whole world, unquote. Truman then says that he has no choice but to drop a third atomic bomb when it's ready on Tokyo. In Tokyo, various military bigwigs meet and make up a resolution saying that the military will obey the will of the emperor. This is basically a written version of the verbal warning given to the Army and Navy on the 12th. On the 15th, shortly after the emperor's speech is recorded, but not before the recordings leave the palace, about 1,000 Japanese soldiers of the 2nd Guards Regiment, led by 22-year-old Major Kenji Hatanaka and Lieutenant Colonel Jiro Shizaki, raid the imperial palace to try and destroy the recordings and to protect the emperor. That is, to kidnap him and keep him under their control. Hatanaka had tried earlier on in the evening to recruit General Mori, the head of the Imperial Guard, who refused to say yes or no, whereupon Hatanaka shoots him in the head. Hatanaka then issues Strategic Order 584, using Mori's signature stamp. The order directs the Imperial Guard to seize and secure the Imperial Palace. Hatanaka and the Guard search for the recordings of the Emperor's speech and the Emperor himself, for safekeeping. The recordings are hidden under a mattress and are not found. The emperor is not found either. He's imperially hiding somewhere. The NHK recording personnel are threatened with death, but do not give up the location of the recordings. General Tanaka, who is commanding the entire 1st Guards Division, which includes the now rebellious 2nd Guards Regiment, is told by Hatanaka to support the coup. But Imperial aides in the palace, using the only phone line accidentally not cut by the insurgents, have already called Tanaka to help suppress the insurgents and free the emperor. Other insurgents go to Prime Minister Suzuki's residence. He's seen as the leading peace advocate, which he isn't really, to kill him. Suzuki escapes, but his house is burned to the ground. The insurgents attempt to recruit War Minister Anami, one of the fight-to-the-end Big Six, but he says he will not expose the expressed will of the emperor. Hatanaka's running out of cards to play. Hatanaka then goes to NHK, Radio Tokyo, and pulls his pistol and demands he be put on the air to proclaim a fight-to-the-end message. The late-night radio skeleton crew claim they don't have clearance to do so, and while he's arguing them, General Tanaka of the 1st Guards Division and Hatanaka's superior officer calls NHK on the phone and tells Hatanaka he may not make the broadcast. Surprisingly, Hatanaka obeys this order. The Imperial Guards insurgents in the palace, who are now convinced that Special Order 584 is bogus, leave the palace. After rebuffing the insurgents, Anami commits suicide rather than have to make the choice to support the coup or not, or indeed to hear the emperor reading out the surrender document at all. He leaves behind a note which reads, quote, "I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime," unquote. For losing, I guess. The head of the coup, Hatanaka, shoots himself in the forehead. Shizaki also kills himself, and the attempted coup is over. The recordings are now taken to the NHK, and the emperor's speech announcing Japan's surrender is broadcast at noon, Japanese Standard Time, preceded by the Japanese national anthem. And the title of the broadcast is, quote, "The Imperial Rescript on the Termination of the Greater East Asia War," unquote. To our good and loyal subjects, after pondering deeply the general trends of the war and the actual conditions obtained in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. This goes on for a while, and I won't take up your time. You can certainly find it on the net somewhere. Just a couple of things. The Emperor's Rescript mentions a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which can do damage that is indeed incalculable. But he doesn't mention the Russian invasion of Manchuria. And that should put paid to the speculation of what caused the Japanese surrender. Unless you're trying to sell a book. But the emperor says, and he should know, what caused the surrender. Now, since court language is used, and it is hard to follow anyway, an NHK announcer comes on afterward to make plain that the Japanese are in fact surrendering. Many Japanese had feared that the emperor's broadcast would call for resistance unto death for the nation. The Japanese will not officially release the audio recording of the emperor's speech until July 2015. There are at least 8 whoppers in the speech, which does not actually include the word surrender at all, just the acceptance of the provisions of the Joint Declaration of the Powers. Even to Japanese, the actual meaning of the speech to announce the surrender is not clear, and it must be interpreted by the NHK. The whoppers I spotted are, the emperor says that we have decided to effect a settlement, and the implication of that is that this was Japan imposing peace somehow, which is not true. He also says, we declared war on America and the British to ensure Japanese self-preservation and the stabilization of East Asia, which is not true. The attack on America and Britain was for oil and nothing else. Everything in the Pacific in late 1941 and 1942 was to secure access to oil from Southeast Asia and defend that access, noticeably to the Dutch East Indies. He also says, it being far from our thoughts to infringe on the sovereignty of other nations or embark upon territorial aggrandization. The Japanese conquests in 1941 and 2 are precisely to gain territory. Next up, should we continue to fight, not only would it result in the ultimate collapse and the obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the extinction of all human civilization. Sure, this is making a silk purse out of a sow's ear. The emperor is trying, it sounds like, to say he can control the use of weapons of mass destruction for the whole world and thus save us all. What a guy. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all generations to come. Now, they started the war, in China specifically, and then attacked everybody in range. So, the result was, silk purse, sow's ear. He declares that the war has not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Well, since your cities are in ashes and your people are starving, your navy's in ruins, your army falling apart, your war of aggression has failed utterly, leading to the complete destruction of your nation, I would say you lost. He also mentions the new and cruel bomb. Now, the emperor's been able to look out the window since March and see the results of normal bombing on his capital city and know about 60 others. He must also know that B-29s could have blasted his palace into rubble if they had pleased to do so from March on, and didn't because they decided not to. From his point of view, the new and cruel bomb is simply a quick way to do what's been done to Japan for the last 5 months. The emperor in this case is following his cabinet's decision to try and divert the people from the hash he, the government, and the military have made out of everything for more than a decade. He says he has been able to safeguard and maintain the kokutai, which is not true. The Japanese have accepted the Potsdam Declaration and have not safeguarded the kokutai at all. The kokutai will be burned to the ground and remade as the Allies like. The secondary whopper is that by claiming to uphold the kokutai, the emperor is implying that his status in Japan is unchanged, rather than being at the command of Douglas MacArthur. At a White House meeting before the Japanese surrender is broadcast, Truman tells his staff that he will allow a third atomic bomb to be used on Tokyo. That is, to kill the emperor. After the emperor's speech in Japan is heard, Truman announces the Japanese have surrendered and orders the end of all offensive operations against Japan. Hereafter, 15th will be known as VJ, Victory over Japan Day. It is also proclaimed and celebrated on the same day in England. Marshall sends to MacArthur that, quote, your directive as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers is effective with the receipt of this message, unquote. Or perhaps better translated, we won. Admiral Ugaki hears the surrender broadcast. He decides he must atone for his various failures in the war. He determines to make a kamikaze attack on U.S. Navy ships around Okinawa. Ugaki makes a short speech to his staff in which he exhorts them to revenge this defeat in the future. He climbs into the backseat of a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy bomber, and with 9 other planes whose crews he has asked to follow him, takes off for the glorious death he has condemned so many Japanese aviators to. The normal backseat crewman for the Judy insists on going along, so now there's 3 guys crammed into the cockpit, built for 2. 7 of the 10 planes, 3 have mechanical troubles and turn back, fly south hunting for targets. But if they find any, they don't do any damage at all. USN ships record firing on some incoming aircraft, but record no hits by any kamikazes. A crashed plane will later be found with 3 dead men in it. One of the dead men has a green officer's uniform and is probably the admiral. Ugaki died as uselessly as his men did. Chiang Kai-shek in China delivers a radio address commonly known as the repayment of wrongdoing with kindness speech. In it, he says that China's anger at the Japanese leadership that brutalized so many Chinese since 1937 is not directed at the Japanese people themselves. Retaliation should not be engaged in. Quote, we must not insult the innocent civilians of our enemy nation. We can only treat them, who are controlled and driven by a Nazi-like military clique, with grace so they can repent of their mistakes and sin. Unquote. This is a remarkably generous policy by the Chinese who suffered 8 years of relentless killing by the Japanese. Unfortunately, this generosity of spirit will not be returned by the Japanese. Pretty much ever. The Japanese now begin with a renewed frenzy destroying military and government records in an effort to erase any evidence that might be used in war crimes trials. Messages are dispatched to all bases and units overseas for the same reason. A later study in 2003 of the inventory of orders, results, messages, and so on determined that 70% of all such records are so destroyed. Destroying records like that is not the action of the innocent. Any bureaucrat in any organization or government in any land on earth loves a burn bag. Since Anami has killed himself, the new Japanese army minister, Prince Higashikumi, signs the order of surrender. The prince is also prime minister. He's the first prime minister in Japan who is also a relative of the emperor. Onishi Takejiro, who 2 days ago stormed into a ministerial meeting to declare that 20 million civilian deaths were a reasonable price for victory, commits seppuku in his headquarters. Onishi was the deviser of the tactics of kamikaze attacks. He leaves behind a note apologizing to the 4,000 or so pilots he sent to their deaths. When he stabs himself, he refuses to use the customary second to behead him after he stabs himself. So he takes 15 hours to die. Pilots at Atsugi Air Base, commanded by Captain Kozuno Yasuna, convince themselves that the emperor's radio address is a fake, made by pacifists and subverting the emperor's actual will of continued resistance. They'll shortly start flying missions over Tokyo and Yokohama, dropping leaflets urging continued resistance. The Japanese radio to MacArthur in Manila, asking for a clarification of the message from him that used the phrase, certain requirements for carrying into effect the terms of surrender, when they come to meet with him in Manila. The Japanese apparently believe that MacArthur may be expecting the military personnel who fly to Manila would sign the entire surrender document there and then. MacArthur replies that the meeting in Manila is to arrange details of the surrender to occur later. The Japanese reply that they'll be able to send a 16-man delegation to Manila on the 19th. The Russians end their advance into Korea in fidelity to their agreement to split Korea. On the 17th, the Emperor issues a second rescript to back up his surrender but not say surrender, the one he did on the 15th. This one directed specifically at the military. The Emperor certainly has evidence enough that the military is not necessarily playing ball by them trying to kidnap him. This rescript specifically includes all Japanese in the home islands and serving overseas, the entire military. It's clear to the Emperor and his advisors that the army, in particular, is still not convinced that the Emperor would ever announce his surrender, much less personally announce it himself. Some declare that the entire August 15th broadcast is an American fake. Only a minority of the military had ever heard the Emperor speak, so they don't know it's his voice or not. This rescript is intended to hammer the point home. Surrender. It works, even though some diehards will not surrender and kill themselves. The rescript to the military, which he does not do on the radio, you can read it elsewhere. It says, you've done a great job fighting, that the fighting spirit of the Army and Navy is high as ever, with a view to maintaining and protecting our noble national polity. He expresses grief at the deaths of all the military folks who have died in his name. And it ends, we trust that you officers and men of the imperial forces will comply with our intention and maintain a solid unity and strict discipline in your movements, and that you will bear the hardest of all difficulties, bear the unbearable, and leave an everlasting foundation of the nation. The Imperial General Staff sends to all major commands, this is picked up and decoded by the U.S. Magic program, that although the Army will surrender, quote, from the highest authority in our land, Japan, for her part, however, certainly will not consider her soldiers as having been taken prisoner, regardless of how the enemy may handle the problem. Therefore, be sure to assemble your units, do your best to maintain discipline, and see to it that the gist of this message is made clear to all echelons. A separate intercept is a message from the commander of the southern area, what's left of the forces in Burma, Indochina, and so on, says to his men to obey the Emperor in full, but until the surrender is signed, all units should, quote, resist any attempt of the enemy to use force of arms against you, unquote. Whatever that means. Now, it can be argued that the Army is basically keeping units available to keep its options open in Tokyo for a coup, even after the Emperor's broadcast. The second rescript is intended to be, I mean it. And it works. Sorry, boys, we lost, but let's not screw things up further. 3 princes of the Japanese Emperor leave by air to make sure the second rescript is understood by the large commands overseas. They do this with a guarantee of safety from MacArthur. Truman answers a request from Stalin to allow Russian troops to join in the occupation of the home islands with an emphatic no. He does, however, confirm the Soviet possession of Kuril Islands, which the Russians are already invading. On the 18th, the last U.S. air combat death in World War II is Sergeant Anthony Marcone, whose B-52 reconnaissance plane was attacked by 2 Japanese interceptors. Marcone is hit in the chest by a 20mm cannon shell and dies shortly thereafter. B-32s were built by Consolidated Air as sort of a backup to B-29s, because the B-29s had well-known mechanical issues, and if it turned out that they just weren't up to the task, the B-32 was the replacement. The B-32 that was attacked survived the attacks with only damage to 1 engine and 1 crewman dead. Japanese ministry sends radio message to the home island local police to create, quote, comfort women, unquote, sites to service the U.S. occupational force, because the telephone system is in ruins. It might be recalled that the Japanese created numerous comfort women sites to make use of women prisoners to be raped by horny Japanese soldiers. And yeah, that's something they still deny. U.S. aircraft began parachuting medical supplies and aid teams into POW camps in the home islands. A Chinese plane dropping leaflets to Japanese troops in Inner Mongolia informing them about the end of the war is shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Chinese communists attack Hong Kong, still garrisoned by the Japanese. The communist attack is defeated. Remember, the Japanese have surrendered to the nationalist Chinese, so an attack by the communists can still be fought off in fidelity to the surrender document. Nimitz sends to all naval command to remind everybody in the U.S. military that everybody in Japan may not be all that happy with surrendering and freelancing to attack U.S. ships and aircraft, as we saw in the failed kamikaze attack a couple days ago. In Manchuria, Field Marshal Hatta is given an ultimatum to surrender by Soviet General Shelenkov. There's still fighting going on with die-hard Japanese troops despite surrender. Our old friend Leo Szilard begins sending letters to the editors of science magazines in hopes of getting them to publish the July 17th permission. He's still trying to circumvent Groves and Truman. On the 19th, the Japanese delegation headed by General Kawabe arrives in Manila to work out a schedule of surrender. They are met by U.S. Generals Willoughby and Sutherland. MacArthur does not appear. General Yamada, commander of the Kwangtung Army in Manchuria, well, what's left of it, surrenders to the Red Army. Unlike the Americans, the Russians will take prisoners from the Kwangtung Army, more than 650,000 of them, and they'll be packed off to forced labor camps for up to 10 years. Somewhere between 60,000 and 345,000 Japanese will die there. The vast difference in the counting is because the Russians are doing the counting and they don't care. To remind you, through the war, as an Allied POW of the Japanese, your chances of being murdered were over 4 in 10. U.S. or British prisoners of the Germans, your chance was less than 1 in 100. Everybody's prisoners kept by the Russians had a 1 in 4 chance of ever seeing home again. If you were a Russian captive of the Germans, your chances of survival were about 1 in 3. Japanese in Allied custody had a 9 out of 10 chance of returning home. That said, surrendering in a combat zone is an extremely iffy proposition. Much is made of killing Japanese supposedly trying to surrender early in the war by U.S. forces, and Russians by the Germans. The U.S. discovered that prisoners made excellent sources of information. The Germans, unfortunately, just didn't care one way or another. Both the Russians and the Japanese considered anyone who surrendered was a traitor. MacArthur orders the end to any preparations for an amphibious landing against any Japanese garrison anywhere in the Pacific. No need to get killed after the Japanese have surrendered. At the Ueno Art Museum in Tokyo, around 400 armed soldiers have congregated as an armed anti-surrender group, so they can't decide what to do. Their leader, Major Shigeru Sugi, refuses to obey orders to disband his group of soldiers. Today, Major Ishihara Sadokichi, an officer of the Japanese Guard Division, is sent to speak personally with Shigeru. While Ishihara and Shigeru are discussing what is to be done, a lieutenant among the Shigeru rebels walks up to Ishihara and shoots him dead. Shigeru then shoots the lieutenant. The spell of save the emperor from his advisors on the 400 young men is broken, and they drift away overnight. Shigeru and 3 other rebel officers kill themselves. The Japanese population is admonished by the government to not fraternize with occupation forces, an order that is impossible to enforce or obey anyway soon enough. My father, who was among some of the first military to arrive in Japan, said that the Japanese were kind of listless. They didn't know what was going to happen. And as time went on, they became not friendly, but tolerant. They did not fear the Americans anymore. Another demilitarization measure will be the confiscation of officer swords, so-called samurai swords, as a measure to take some of the luster off the officer class. About 5,500 swords are seized. By the 1990s, about 3,200 of those had been returned or donated to Japanese museums. Sword production will not be allowed in Japan until 1953, not even by handmade techniques for traditional weapons. Most currently available samurai swords, in the West anyway, are not even made in Japan, and certainly not by hand. The government in Japan orders that all fighting is to cease by August 22nd. In the event, most of the fighting is over as soon as the emperor's order is received. Blackout regulations in Japan are lifted for the first time since December 1941. The Japanese chief of prisoner of war camps sends a message to all camp commanders. Quote, documents which would be unfavorable for us in the hands of the enemy are to be treated in the same way as secret documents and destroyed. Personnel who ill-treated prisoners of war and internees, or who are held in extremely bad odor by them, are permitted to take care of the situation by immediately transferring or fleeing without trace. Unquote. What can I say? At Los Alamos, a test plutonium core reaches critical mass, but does not explode, when Harry Daghlian accidentally drops a tungsten carbide brick. The core is surrounded by these bricks during tests. They're neutron reflectors, while doing an experiment that moves parts of the core closer to each other for criticality testing. The core briefly does go critical, irradiating Daghlian. He dies 25 days later of radiation poisoning. Robert Hemmerly, sitting 12 feet away at a desk, develops leukemia 33 years later, which may or may not be due to the radiation dose he received. This is the same core that will kill Louis Slotkin in May 1946 and contribute to the later deaths of 5 others. This plutonium core gets the nickname the Demon Core, and hands-on testing of it are suspended. The Demon Core will later be melted down for use in other cores. But let's not get too frothy about this. In the time between Daghlian and Slotkin's death, 6 Los Alamos employees will be killed in automobile accidents. Japanese Army orders units to disarm, beginning around Tokyo, starting on the 25th. This disarmament will be carried out by the simple expedient of the units simply marching away from their deployment area and leaving their weapons where they were. And wherever they wind up, the soldiers will be mustered out there. On the 22nd, in Japan, weather forecasts on NHK radio are permitted for the first time since the war began. During the war, weather was a military secret. The Japanese People's Volunteer Corps, those unfortunately civilian militia with the bamboo sticks who were intended to be cannon fodder in the event of an invasion, is disbanded on order from the Japanese government. The Japanese Supreme War Direction Council, the Big Six, is dissolved and replaced by a government military War Termination Arrangements Council. This council is to be the interface between the U.S. occupation and the Japanese government to ensure that occupation directives are carried out. On the 23rd, the Red Army in Manchuria overruns Harbin, the location of Unit 731. Unit 731 has been ordered to destroy all documents, installation, and kill any remaining inmates, and then flee. This has all been done. A few documents we missed, and several personnel will be captured. The Japanese will deny the existence or purpose of 731 until the 2000s. A list of who even worked at 731 will by the Japanese archives until 2018. In 2005, Jin Chenmin, a Chinese researcher who is an expert on 731, found records at the Central Archives and at two provincial archives that turn out to detail 1,463 of an estimated 10,000 or more people transported by the Japanese to Harbin between 1937 and 1945. 318 records are found to fully describe the victim, including photographs of the unfortunate. Listed in these records is also the reason for this special deportation to 731. These include descriptions such as incorrigible, die-hard anti-Japanese, and of no value or use. Turns out the Japanese are as good at coming up with euphemisms to describe murder victims as the Germans were, and everybody else. This digression is going to take a while, but misinformation about 731 and its commander is so pervasive it needs some setting straight. Unit 731, commanded by General Ishishiro, was created by the Emperor, as we will shortly see, to perform biological and chemical warfare development. It and other biowar sites in China were known to the Japanese as the Ishi Network. Among the agents developed at the Ishi Network were Black Plague, typhus, septimic plague, Neisseria meningitis, causes meningitis, and Shigelia. The effects of these diseases was tested on living subjects who, after the researchers were done with them, were killed. The researchers, my ass. Other things like extreme cold, naphtha from flamethrowers, and more conventional methods of death were also studied. You might remember Joseph Mengele did this kind of thing. They performed vivisection of people infected with various agents so their organs could be removed from the victim while alive. There's more, lots more. Read up on it if you like. I've read up quite enough, thank you. The denial over 731 and other war crimes continued into the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. In 2002, the Japanese High Court ruled that there was evidence of biological warfare in China, but refused to do anything further, although it did confirm that 731 existed, which is the first official admission of 731 in 57 years. In 2005, the same court ruled that since the pre-1945 government had murdered all them people, the current Japanese government had no responsibility to pay compensation to biological warfare victims and their families. This was 8 years after the case for compensation was brought to the court. The general Japanese reaction to war crimes is simply denying everything and cast themselves as innocent victims of the aggression of others, notably of the Americans, and the Americans are all too ready to believe it, especially those who were not alive during the war. The war itself, runs this denier logic, was forced on Japan by the U.S. criminal withholding of oil for the entirely unjustified, the Japanese announced, reason that the Japanese were killing Chinese by the thousands. Many Japanese, including in government, still deny Unit 731's existence, despite the High Court ruling. If the Japanese were any more into denial of disastrous actions, they'd be Americans. Worse still, it turns out that 731 was created by the Emperor himself, by imperial decree in 1936. An amended memo describing what is to be done with the Emperor's decree is dated April 23, 1936. Understandably, the original decree was destroyed in an attempt to avoid war crimes trials. The memo describing the decree, which was also personally approved by the Emperor on May 21, 1936, has survived. Ain't bureaucracy grand? Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko, the Emperor's uncle, personally witnessed human experiments at 731. Prince Chikubu, the Emperor's younger brother and heir to the throne, attended lectures and vivisections in the 1930s by Ishishiro himself. Prince Mikasa, another of the Emperor's younger brothers, visited 731. Prince Tsuneyoshi, the Emperor's cousin, was financial officer of the Kwangtung Army and personally oversaw the funding of Unit 731. Prince Takeda also regularly visited the 731 and other biowar camps on inspection tours, and his office issued permits for others to visit the camp. Unit 731 was secret, but well known by high-level government functionaries, up to and including the Emperor. Any sort of assertion that 731 was some sort of rogue unit is simply out of the question. Responsibility for 731 is ultimately to be placed at the feet of the emperor and his successors. All the work at 731 was done with the blessings of the emperor, and denial overseen by the current emperor's father, Akihito. There is use of 731 expertise in biological warfare after the war by the Russians, who put the captured 731 scientists in their hands to work building the positively massive Russian biological warfare establishment after the war. Much is made of the U.S. giving Ishii, the head of 731, immunity from war crimes charges in exchange for his secret copy of the records of the horrors committed there, kept precisely for this reason. This is usually taken as a cynical decision to bring Ishii to the U.S. to instruct the U.S. how to make biological warfare agents. But the U.S. already had its own biowar program, in some ways more advanced than what Ishii was doing. The U.S. biological efforts were begun in November 1942. By mid-1943, the main research facility at Camp Detrick, now Fort Detrick, was testing agents and delivery mechanisms, which were more advanced than Ishii's, by the way. 3 other sites were involved, the Vigo Ordnance Plant in Indiana, and testing sites at Horn Island, Mississippi, and Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah. The U.S. project involved anthrax, botulism toxins, and herbicides as agents, which were far less dangerous to one's own side than infectious agents, as Ishii himself discovered in May 1942 when his men launched a biowar attack on Chinese units in Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces, which infected 10,000 Japanese soldiers and killed 1,700 of them. The U.S. didn't need Ishii's help at all to create their own hellish agents. The U.S. production in 1945, by the way, could fill 500,000 bombs. Ishii's production could fill clay pots. So if the U.S. didn't need Ishii, why make a deal with him? If Ishii had not been convinced to turn those records over, the very existence of Unit 731 could have been denied forever by the Japanese. Even so, its existence is still denied in some Japanese circles, including in schools, in the hope that the existence of 731 and the evil done there will be washed away by time in the service of the Japanese obsession with being a victim. But back to our story. On the 24th, General Tanaka, who had commanded the 1st Guards Division during the attempted coup on the 15th and was instrumental in putting the coup down, commits suicide by shooting himself. P.L. Henshaw and R.R. Kovanu, health scientists from the Oak Ridge facility, write an analysis of the health effects, other than being blasted to bits, of the Hiroshima bomb based on a UPI translation of a Japanese report broadcast from Radio Tokyo. The report describes effects that it puts into various categories: light flash and heat burns. Remember, Radio Tokyo is now, at least in theory, no longer a propaganda outlet. So these 2 guys decide to believe them for their analysis. The brilliant bit of their analysis was the realization that people who were described as dying for reasons unknown had died from lethal radiation from the bomb. Long-term effects are not yet known, but this is being irradiated by the bomb at the time. The general expectation from Los Alamos had been that the damage done by what they call ionizing radiation was summed up in the saying that anybody who might receive a lethal dose of radiation would first be killed by a flying brick. That is, blast damage. The range of lethal radiation was less than the blast damage. And so they could blissfully say that the A-bomb was just a really big bomb. This analysis turns the A-bombs into something rather more sinister than the Los Alamos people expected, and probably saved a lot of lives in the years to come. On the 25th, MacArthur postpones the official surrender ceremony in Tokyo Bay by 2 days to September 2nd to allow 2 typhoons in and around the home islands to clear out. On the 27th, major elements of the U.S. Pacific Fleet arrive in Sagami Bay, 40 miles from Tokyo, to accept the surrender of Yokosuka Naval Base. The total number of Allied ships is 23 carriers, 12 battleships, 26 cruisers, 116 destroyers and destroyer escorts, and 12 submarines, plus whatever support ships can be spared to make the fleet look gigantic, which it certainly is. By now, 1,360 Japanese women from Tokyo have signed up to be comfort women for occupation forces. Their houses will be called Recreation and Amusement Association houses, and they will allow to operate until January 1946, when a survey finds that 70% of the comfort women have syphilis and 50% have gonorrhea, and have certainly been infected by their U.S. customers. By April 1946, massive amounts of penicillin will have been imported into Japan to deal with the problem, but not necessarily the embarrassment. The Manhattan Project Security Division sends Leo Szilard an official message that his July 17th petition is classified secret and threatens Szilard with being fired from his cushy position at the Met Lab if he breaks that secrecy by unilaterally declassifying it. On the 28th, early in the day, the pilots at Atsugi Air Base, who had convinced themselves that the Emperor's rescript was a fake and had been flying over Tokyo dropping leaflets, give up. Also, their commander is rather obviously unstable and may have been since the 15th. Later the same day, 150 technicians and engineers landed at Tsugi to set up equipment to be air controllers for the swarm of air transports to come. They are not initially accompanied by any men to protect them from the Japanese, but are unhindered anyway. 3 hours after the technicians have set things up, the first of 38 transports fly in, bringing some protection troops, but mostly supplies to convert a Japanese airfield into a U.S. airfield. They are also unhindered by the Japanese. The Japanese Foreign Ministry stops burning its records, and like all good bureaucrats, begins an immediate project to inventory what they didn't burn. As we know, a later survey will determine that about 70% of all the paper records in the home islands are lost, and the only copies of the interesting documents will be found in archives far away from the home islands. On the 29th, the battleships USS Missouri and Iowa arrive in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremonies. Truman has personally selected the USS Missouri for the surrender ceremonies. Quite coincidentally, Truman is from Missouri. On the 30th, U.S. troops at Atsugi Air Base expand their security zone to encompass Yokohama. This is for security for MacArthur, who arrives by air today. MacArthur is taken to the New Grand Hotel in Yokohama. Not sure how grand it would be after all that bombing. Meanwhile, troops and supplies in Skytrain transports touch down at Atsugi every 3 minutes all day. On the 31st, MacArthur formally takes command of the Japanese government. He's the first non-Japanese to rule over Japan in over 1,200 years, since the Nara period, or, depending on who's counting, 2,600 years since the Emperor Jimmu-Tenno. On September 2nd, Japan formally surrenders in a ceremony overseen by Douglas MacArthur on board the Missouri. By now, 250 Allied warships are anchored in Tokyo Bay. The Japanese are brought in a launch from Tokyo to the Missouri and are met with complete silence, except for the clacks and whirring cameras to record the ceremony. The party is 11 men, 7 army men in dress uniforms, plus 3 civilians. 2 civilians in frock coats of formal diplomatic wear, and 1 man, Ota Saburo from the Foreign Office, who wears an incongruous all-white suit with white shoes and a black fedora. Foreign Minister Mamoru will sign on behalf of the Emperor, and General Umetsu will sign on behalf of the military. Allied officers are in khaki uniforms, that is, normal, wartime on duty, and enlisted men in whites. Nimitz remarks that he's ordered the men at the peace ceremony to look the same way they did during the war. Just before the signing ceremony begins, the Japanese present MacArthur with an imperial rescript ordering the Japanese surrender. It's the first official use of the word surrender in a rescript. Neither the surrender announcement nor the supplementary rescript for the military use the word. This rescript has actually been written by MacArthur's staff and presented to the Emperor as, sign here. This is another one that's long. You can look it up for yourself. It says that they accept the Potsdam Declaration and surrender, and all hostilities should cease. Japan agrees to surrender, to obey all provisions of the Potsdam Declaration, see that all orders from MacArthur are obeyed, inventory and collect weapons and telecommunications factories and bases so that they can't get handed out for some sort of uprising later. POWs will be kept safe and well. Command of all POW camp is now the senior Allied commander in the camp, and any records in the camp, which you might remember had been ordered destroyed, any records that survive in the camps are also to be collected. The Japanese will, quote, aid and assist, unquote, in occupation forces as they move into and around the country. Any arms in the hands of civilians must be turned over. There are 2 copies of the actual surrender document to be signed, one to be kept by the Japanese and one to be kept by the Allies. The table to be used for the signing is discovered to be too small to hold both copies at the same time. James Starnes, the Missouri officer of the deck, races down to the ship's mess to obtain a longer folding table with a green tablecloth, which has coffee stains on it, to cover it. At 9:03, MacArthur gives a short speech, and then the Japanese come forward to sign the surrender documents. The Japanese sign the surrender documents only 10 minutes after they've come on board the Missouri. MacArthur and other Allied representatives sign for each of their countries. On the Japanese copy, Colonel L.M. Cosgraves of Canada signs in the wrong place. The Allied version is signed correctly. The signing is now complete. MacArthur closes the ceremony simply, quote, let us pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always. These proceedings are closed, unquote. The Japanese depart for Tokyo, taking their copy of the surrender document. On the 27th, Emperor Hirohito will visit MacArthur at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo as a sign of his subordination to MacArthur. The Emperor has never traveled to any other leader, and the symbolism of this is not lost on anyone. The 2 men meet for about 10 minutes, then the Emperor goes back to the palace. The symbolism of that isn't lost either. The Allies run the country, the Emperor won't stand in their way. The surrender does not actually make peace between the Allies and Japan, which is diplomatically not the same thing as surrendering. The document making peace is not signed until September 8, 1951. In that peace document, the Japanese agreed to accept results of war crimes trials, to give up any claim to Korea, Formosa, and various other territories not already lost to the Allies, allow free trade with Japan, reparation, compensations, and the like. It also strips Japan of the official title, the Japanese Empire. I hope this presentation has been of some interest to you, and it might help you to read more on your own. Wikipedia is not good enough for history. You've got to read more, and you'll understand more. You understand the past, you understand the present. Bye-bye.